legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt, and my guests today are Thomas Sheridan and Neil McDonald. In a wide-ranging talk, we cover many subjects, including historical witch hunt mania and witch trials, the modern-day witch hunts of COVID-19, elite use of occult forces against the lower classes, magic, the conscious focus and direction of energy and intent, psychometry, energy fields of objects which can record their history, quantum retrocausality and the illusion of linear time, and consciousness as the fundamental stratum of reality. Hello and welcome, Thomas. Neil, thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
That's good. Thank you very much for inviting us again, Greg. Very much appreciate it.
Excellent. We've had a real blast last times we've done this. So today we're going to be talking. It's going to be a conversation spinning off from a project that you guys are. I think you're just completing it at the minute. There's a book already out, Alison's Lament: The Pendle Witch Story Retold, an Occult Insight. You're also making a film. If people want to know, people should know. A lot of people listening to this will know who Thomas is. If they go back to our previous interviews with the three of us, they can get biographical information. I don't need to go into all of that now, I think, but maybe you could just give us the genesis of this project. Clearly, I know this is a topic that you're both very interested in. You're coming at it from your own respective angles. So yeah, just tell us how this started and what it was really about this story that you thought you'd like give your perspective on.
About 10 years ago, I saw, when I was doing an event in Lancashire, someone took me to Pendle Hill for the first time. And I found the atmosphere very interesting. There was a little bit of a witchcraft tourism industry going on. And people told me, they were wise women and healers and, kind of a new age Wiccan kind of aspect to it. And I knew that wasn't the full story, and I didn't really have much interest in it until years later when I noticed, talking to Neil casually, he just mentioned that he runs a tour to Pendle Hill for that reason, for the witchcraft and the witch trials reason. And I said to him, well, what's your theory on it? And he gave me his theory on it, and suddenly it was a whole new world for me. This was far more than, just a run-of-the-mill witch trial, as it would be portrayed in the sort of like orthodox, scientific, historic kind of sense. And it certainly wasn't the new agey kind of, wise women who were persecuted by the man for no reason type thing either. The story was very, very complex. And two things stood out to me. One, it proved magic worked. And the second thing was that it taught me that the establishment had a paralyzing fear of the peasantry having access to witchcraft.
Yeah, so my sort of beginnings, really. So being from this area, from Lancashire, it's kind of always been there. Just in the sort of the zeitgeist, it's part of who we are. It's a very important story for sort of most sort of Lancashire families, really. And so it was in 2012 that I decided to sort of commemorate it, because that was a 400-year anniversary of 1612 when the trials were and all these things happened. So that's when I started doing tours there. It's kind of, it's gone on for all these years. But like Thomas says, there's a lot more to it than just the just that idea of power. I mean, the power is very, very, very important to it. But it's like we've said at the moment, why do the elites keep doing what they're doing? Well, I'm sure it's because they are frightened of losing what they've got, losing the power over us. So I think that's kind of the basis of it all.
Is is Pendle Hill? I'm trying to decide if I've been there or not. Is there a viaduct or nearby?
There is, yeah. There's a railway viaduct on the line that goes to Blackburn.
Right. I have been there and I got some photographs. Now, that's interesting because I went there. I can't remember what time of year it was, but it must have been quite late in the year because I remember it was afternoon and the sun was starting to set. And we went right down to the foot of the viaduct, such an impressive structure. And we got off the train at the station nearby. And it was only when we got right down to the viaduct and I turned around and looked back in the direction we come from that I saw the hill. And the light on it was so strange. And I'm going to go and dig out those photographs after this, actually. And it was really, there was such something about it. And I was just, again, it's not compared to mountains in some parts of the world. This is a hill. This is not some grand snow-capped thing, rising up through the clouds. But there was something about it. And I just kept staring at it. And there was a reason I took multiple photographs of it. We walked about a further mile parallel to the hill, and I kept taking pictures, and the light was kind of amazing. There was definitely something about it, and I don't know why, because a big old mass of earth and rock like that anywhere else in the country probably wouldn't have captured my attention. So, but when I was reading your book, I thought, hang on a minute, and I saw the picture of it, and I thought, I think I've been there. So I thought it was interesting that it captured my attention in the way that it did, and it reminded me of this idea, like for example, Rupert Sheldrake has expounded, and I think increasingly it's not his idea as such, but he's given a scientific polish to it, that everything on some level is imbued with consciousness. The sun, the moon, the earth itself, rocks, at some level, if consciousness is fundamental, then of course it permeates everything. It is everything. Everything originates from it, including this hill.
Yeah, well, I think it's the place itself just emanates an atmosphere of the past. You can feel it as you approach. As children, we used to go up there on Halloween. Strangely enough, there used to be hundreds of people who go up there on Halloween, and so that over the centuries, it's just gathered this energy, and you can feel it when you're there, when you arrive in that area. I think Thomas said that when we first did our little film right at the beginning, you felt an atmosphere then, didn't you?
Yeah, there's a strong sense of animism to Pendle Hill itself, that you feel this thing is constantly looking at you. To use the old expression from that movie, "The Hills Have Eyes," it does feel like that. It feels like this thing is looking down on you. It's very peculiar, but the entire countryside around it is almost like in a vortex or something. There's a very strange sense of melancholia about the whole Pendle, what they call a Pendle witch country area. And you can the sensitive person is immediately aware that this is a place of dark secrets, or secrets, should I say. You're in a kind of different spiritual domain. And I'm not surprised that over the years it attracted all kinds of sort of religious, strangeness. Like the Quakers were founded there after the guy who founded the Quakers appeared upon Pendle Hill, as if it gave him the instruction to find the religion. And there's all kinds of weird stories like that. The actual landscape does feel alive. Yeah, it doesn't have, interestingly enough, in the record, any kind of druidic or druidry or Celtic or even megaliths. There's nothing like that there. There's no kind of ancient history, which in some ways, funny enough, actually makes it more powerful or something. The fact that it's not calling upon this kind of ancient reputation to bring it to life. And I find that tremendously fascinating.
Well, it's strange you should mention the George Fox thing. I was going to do the same thing, because I used to do a tour. I don't do it anymore. It was something like The Unusual Religions of Lancashire. And it just seems that area seems to bring things like that to fruition. There was a George Fox thing. There was also a religion down the road called the Gringletonians, and there's another one called the Ingamites, and of course there's the witchcraft thing. It's as if there's something there that people latch onto. So it's only spiritual but different.
I know you've spoken. I'm very interested in psychometry, Thomas. I know you've written and spoken about this, and I think you know a great deal more about it than me. But this idea that, well, stones in particular, but I think that almost any material object can receive and retain energy from events, basically, and that can be psychic energy as well as energy from from physical happenings, as it were, and not necessarily negative, but in I think many of the most notable cases it has been, because you're looking at extreme energy and things like death, for example. Obviously, there's an extreme energetic outlets at that point.
Wherever there's dry stone walls, I've discovered, in the absence of megaliths, wherever there are dry stone walls, whether it be the north of England, the west of Ireland, or New England in America, there is that hauntological psychometric energy force exists. I think the psychometric state of stone walls, dry stone walls now, is very underappreciated. And I think you will find that a lot of the cultures where dry stone walls exist, there's tremendous folklore, there's tremendous hauntological resonance in the landscape. And I think that's really what there's no megaliths, but you can do it with dry stone walls. They also have that psychometric power in them. You think of those stones, they were brought up to the surface by cold weather, or they were dug out of the earth. They're put together with mortar in such a way they have an almost noetic nature about them that the person picking up the stone will slot it into just the right place. I don't think I've ever tried making a dry stone wall or repairing one, but you realize soon enough it's like a supernatural ability that these people who build these walls have, to be able to find just the right stone to go into just the right spot. And so you think about that. You think about the people building those walls. They're demarcating the landscape in a kind of a megalithic kind of way when you think about it. And the stones, each field or boundary that the stones surround is almost like a magic circle of its own, or a magic square, or a magic rectangle.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can actually do, without becoming a dry stone waller, fully trained and skilled. I've noticed somewhere that they actually run, I think it's just like encounter type experiences where you can go and do a day of it, get your first start, have a go at dry stone walling. And it's just interesting. I know someone who has run those things. It's really interesting, the people that show up to them, people that you just wouldn't expect, and they seem to get a surprising amount out of it, even more than they were, if they had any expectations, more than they expected. So it's just interesting in, climate that's, I'm talking about social and technological climate, when there's no quote unquote need for it, that certain heritage skills seem to persist, and that even if they don't really know why, some people are involved in preserving them and passing them on seem to kind of, even if they can't articulate it, there's some kind of special significance here, and this mustn't be allowed to die out.
In the north of England, where, as you probably know, the Lake District, everywhere stone walls. It comes from a time, doesn't it, from the closures as well, which was quite the time when a lot of the landscape was robbed from people. And then you've got the Shap Avenue. So you go to the place, I don't know if you've been to Shap, it's really high up on the highest place that you can pass through on a motorway. And there used to be a Shap Avenue there. It was about 1.5 to 2 miles long. Started off at the Stone Circle, the Grey Cross Stone Circle, went right through the town and up on a hill. And all those stones, I mean, there must have been thousands of stones. They were all blown up, taken down, and all the stones in the area, all the walls in the area were made out of those stones. So that just gives it a whole different aspect to the, and I think you can feel it when you go.
Yeah, I have passed through that area many times when driving from England to Ireland via Scotland, coming up the M6. Yeah, there's you have to watch yourself on that particular stretch of motorway, because there's so much spectacular scenery around. that you can, how should you cross it? You can cross the median, as they say in the States. Even then, there was a kind of special energy, and of course, always good to stop at T-Bay for that reason.
The best, yeah, without a doubt.
So, in my recent interview, listeners can find, I did with John Michael Greer. The interview was entitled "The Secret of the Grail." I'm mentioning this because in it, he's trying to trace Grail legends, and and they, where this originated, what it might mean, in the terms of there being reality to it. What about locations, historical figures? I mean, this has been done time and time again, and he's basically shown, as others have, that these legends, are repeated down centuries and millennia. In fact, very similar types of characters, in the same way that you have the Jesus story repeated lots of different places, and many mythological and archetypal sort of stories. We seem to have different parts of the world have their own version of it. But in his book, he ends up in exactly your part of the country, Neil, looking for some of these Grail locations. And he talks about the uncertain, or he's talking about a particular area that really had some strange...
the debatable lands.
The debatable lands. This fascinated me, absolutely. And he ends up very much there and up to the Scottish borders looking for some of these Grail locations. Unrelated, perhaps, to the Pendle witch story, but I'm mentioning it because he's in that neck of the woods, literally at that time, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's where the lands, the Scottish border moved backwards and forwards, and so it was nobody knew who really controlled the land in between. But we've got Pendragon Castle, and they think that went back to a time of the Dark Ages. And then there's a little what was it called? There's a little old house that's falling down, a really, really, really old house, and there's a poem connected with that is connected to. Who was the one that was from Lancaster? Lancelot. Really, really, really old poem. It's fantastic. And then there's King Arthur's Round Table, which is just a henge. So you do wonder, don't you, why all these things have got those names? But like you say, it's lost. The reason is lost in time.
It does relate to the Pendle story in a way. I have a great appreciation for Mr. Greer's work, although I haven't heard that latest interview you've done with him. I'm looking forward to it. But if you look at the size of what we call Wales, which is really sort of like the Brittonic Wales, the Welsh country, whatever, it stretched all the way up from, say, Bristol up to the Scottish borders. It was a much larger country back then. And this is, allegedly where the Grail mysteries, the Grail legends, the Grail romances, whatever you want to call them, took place. And up at the Scottish, so you had the south, you had, sort of like where, if you look at places like Glastonbury, was that, Camelot. And then you go all the way up to the Scottish borders. And that's where Merlin, who was a real character called Mithrin, really existed. Now, right in the middle of that is Lancashire. And this may be the reason why Lancashire in the 1600s, at the time of the Pendle witch trials, was considered literally an unknown territory. Neil will tell you more about this, but it's hard to believe. But there was a time where Lancashire was considered basically, no man's land, and that's only about 500 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. I think that perceptions of time, the passage of time, and what what a lifetime amounts to, and I don't know. Just we live in a world of such busyness and just filled with noise and light, and we tend to forget. Maybe we never even really contemplated it. What a different world it was. Even 200 years ago, never mind 500 years. I think if we were able to time travel back even to this period, just be dropped into the middle of it, I think there would be a lot of things that we'd be very surprised by, things we were expecting that we didn't see, and things that we were not expecting that were happening, that existed.
Yeah, things have changed so much over the generations, and if you consider that this is really with the cotton mills mainly, that the Industrial Revolution kind of kicked off in that area as well. So how much did the fact that was possible to come from the past, and how much has it killed off? Or because all these sort of the towns, like Preston was a merchant place, but Accrington, Blackburn, Burnley, Nelson, Colne, all these places all grew up because of the Industrial Revolution. So they didn't really exist apart from very, very small hamlets. And now the developed into huge towns, but with people working from 18 hours a day, and it really was a gruesome life if you were drawn into the mills. But of course, everybody had to be. But how much did that kill off the past? You have to wonder.
It's part of that continuum where first the harrying of the North, from the Norman point of view, and where they basically exterminated the north of England that refused to become Norman. And then you had that, and then you had the Industrial Revolutions. So it's the past really is very far away when you're in a place like Lancashire. And you only get hints of it when I was researching for Alison's Lament and the film, for the book and the film. I was reading documents written by people like magistrates and people involved in the British government, English government, back in 1612, and they would talk about Lancashire like it was the Wild West, like it was the west of Ireland or the most remote parts of Scotland, or even parts of the New World. They had a dread of it. It's really quite fascinating. So the industrial evolution that happened after the Pendle witch event gives you a kind of a false impression of what that part of the world was like. Well, there are still pockets of, and maybe that's the reason why the power of Pendle and the Pendle area is so strong, is because it is a kind of a pocket that survived industrialization. The nearest towns are in the next valley over, like Nelson. I think Burnley is over there as well. But maybe that's why. It was before the Industrial Revolution, it was literally going to Mars as far as the establishment in London was concerned.
Yeah, there was no real control here. Again, it comes back to the debatable lands. And there was the what did he call the groups that used to go out at night, and there was the border reivers. That was it. So there was basically no law. So the border reivers would just be people who would have no normal families during the day, and in the evening they'd go out just helping themselves to the surrounding sheep and cows and whatever they felt like. So for that reason, we were imposed upon by Norman lords. So the king would send up and put Norman lords in position and told to subdue the area. So we're kind of used to it, really.
One of the reasons that Catholicism survived there following the Reformation, and Catholicism is the sort of sectarianism of that time plays a huge factor in the Pendle witch story. One of the reasons that Catholicism survived there is not because of any kind of staunch, desire by the locals to stand up. It was literally, it literally survived because there was no one really coming down on them until the time of the Pendle witch trials. Before that, they were out of the beyond the pale, so to speak, of the Reformation, and therefore it solidified itself within the establishment, within the orthodoxy of London society and English power things, that they associated Catholicism with untamed wildness, and Lancashire was almost seen like a part of Ireland that had been transformed or survived in England in that way, and that it was still Catholic, and it was literally a kind of a plantation was needed. And it began with like witch trials. That was the actual impetus to actually say, we've got to clean this place up of Catholics and witches, because the extreme Calvinist religion of the time, brought down from Scotland by King James, literally believed that the Catholic Mass and the witches' Sabbath were the same thing. And that's no exaggeration. They really believed that.
Oh, let's maybe say a word about James then. James the First of England. He was also James VI of Scotland. And this is King James of the King James Bible fame, a lot of people will know. He would have been someone very much at home with the current cadre of globalists, I think. I read that he travelled to North Berwick, which was at the time it's actually in Scotland, to observe witch trials going on up there. And I also read that he personally oversaw the torture of some of the accused. I don't know about that for sure, but based on what I have read, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. As a very, very paranoid individual and quite a fanatic in his own way.
Yes, that's true. He did oversee the trials. He didn't encourage them. He sat there as an observer to wanted to see how it worked. How this came about was that him and his wife were coming back from Denmark by ship, and the sea blew up, and he was convinced that these witches in Scotland had caused the storm. And that's literally how it came about. So there was a personal vendetta in it for him too.
Yeah, he was one scary guy, wasn't he? And this is something that goes through. It went into the Atlantis book as well, didn't it? It's this group of people, whoever they are, that seem to want to hold on to power so much, and everybody else just has to. Because I know the average person doesn't want power like that, but there seems to be a group out there, and they're always the elites.
And some of them are worse than others. Like, if you look at the first English witchcraft law that was ironically introduced by Queen Elizabeth, who came to power because of witchcraft, essentially, it was toothless, more or less. And there was very few, there was lots of prosecutions, but execution was very, very rare. In fact, the majority of people who were tried with witchcraft up until the time of King James were acquitted. The death sentence was very, very rare. And that's because James changed it from a legal matter. See, prior to that, he'd let the churches in the regions oversee basically the persecution or the rounding up of witches. And these tended to be, as far as he was concerned, lenient. So what he did was he put it in the statute books, more or less, and he gave the witchcraft law that was first passed by Queen Elizabeth, and then actually her father, King Henry VIII did that, and then her. And then he put teeth onto it. He made it a legal statutory framework where the courts could be used, and even a young child could be brought into court in the case of testifying against witches, which would have been considered, outrageous prior to that. You can't have children coming into a courtroom and determining the lives of adults with stories of witchcraft. And again, it reminds me so much of today, where they're desperate to turn the younger generation against the older generation. And it happened so quickly. It happened literally overnight. As soon as he ascended to the throne and came down from Scotland after being basically raised by the Scottish Kirks, he just changed the law to persecute witches and introduced things that would have been considered like outrageous in like a decade before. The changes happened very quickly.
Yeah, and at the same time that they're introducing these laws, you wonder what their personal beliefs were, because there was Elizabeth I had John Dee, an absolute alchemist, as her personal advisor, and James I was a Mason from the Lodge of Scorn and Troon, is it? Or Troon the other way around? But,
yeah.
So he must have some ritual in his background that wasn't anything to do with Protestantism. And then, of course, they were connected to the Knights Templar who came over there to flee the Catholic Church. You wonder, don't you, whether they had a personal belief that all they wanted really was that that the people at the bottom rung of the ladder were allowed to use the same powers.
Yeah, well, that's something we're going to get to actually during this interview.
That's why they put their faces on coins with only one eye shown as a profile. It was apatropathic magic. The one eye on the coin of the regent's head was ward off the evil eye, and they also wore things called gauges, which is what James definitely wore, and it was a small ring on the little finger to avoid hereditary curses. So these people, they didn't rout out the witches in Lancashire and the Scotland and the rest of the UK and well, it wasn't the UK now, the rest of England and Scotland, because they saw it as a social problem. To extent, they routed them out because they themselves were absolutely petrified of witchcraft.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, you look at you think about you point out in the book, how you can look at similarities between what those condemning witchcraft would have called a black mass, the inversion of a Christian mass, and then you look at what a Catholic mass actually entails, and look at whatever to an outsider, a visitor from another planet, looking at these things, they say, well, these are really one and the same thing with just some variations, and then you would have had the same what later became the Protestant Church, in the case we're talking about the Church of England, whatever that is. there's loads of things overhangs from, the Catholic Mass. It's all ceremony, isn't it? It's all magical ceremony, even if it is devoid of energy or the understanding of what's behind it. The going through the motions thing still all derives from the same thing. So you got these people throwing stones at each other when they're really involved in fundamentally the same thing.
Look at the recent coronation of King Charles. That's why so many people all over the world tuned in to watch that, and there was a gigantic collective what the fuck kind of thing watching it, because they were seeing a magical ritual before their eyes. The whole thing of putting up the screens, so he's stripped naked and covered in goose fat. These weird kinds of things that go on, and the strange implements, devices, wands, essentially a scepter, and the use of gems, crystals, whatever. And I think a lot of people watched. I think one of the mistakes the royal family made, or the royals in Britain made, was broadcasting that event live. It didn't go out censored before, like Queen Elizabeth's one 70 years ago as a film. And I think a lot of people around the world said to themselves, these guys are a bunch of occultic weirdos, because that's what they are.
I didn't watch it, but somebody told me that there was a really awkward moment when someone was placing the crown. Maybe one of you guys or both of you might have seen this, placing the crown on the head of King Charles III, and they kind of fumbled it. And Charles looked, like he was not happy about that.
I didn't watch any of the event at all, but I saw that on a YouTube, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he obviously hadn't practiced putting a crown on somebody's head, and he wobbled over the place, and he had to keep moving it into position, and Charles was not happy at all.
Well, right there, you could see a kind of a breaking of a spell, couldn't you, in a way?
Yeah, and there was a time as well where I don't know why, but everything was up front and seen. And for one little bit, he had to go behind a screen and do part of the ritual, then come out again. So
yeah, that was the part where he smeared in goose fat. Naked, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, he is in everything.
Yeah.
Who does the smearing? Is it sort of a Lord High Smear or something?
There will be. I bet there will be one.
Well, they still have their Lord of the Privies, who essentially take care of their bowel movements and things like that.
Changer of the royal potty and things. Yeah.
Yeah, and they have like the Masters of the Swans, where they safeguard these swans. Where they pay a guy to look after and count swans, and only he kills them so they can have it for their Christmas banquet. It's just truly bizarre.
It really is. It's time. Well, it depends what you think about it, but it is very, very old-fashioned, and you do wonder whether they understand. I'm sure the people at the top understand what's behind all these rituals.
I found an old copy of a magazine the other day, and it was a 70s magazine, which I bought a bunch of them, called Man, Myth, and Magic. Remember those? They came into a folder. I bought them because they were never on sale in Ireland when I was growing up. So I got them. I started collecting them. One of them, funny enough, was the astrological chart of Prince Charles, as he was known back then, in the this was 74. And they said one of the things that is said in his horoscope was a major upheaval in the family life caused by an accident.
Yeah, well, I mean, at some point today, towards the end of this chat, we're going to get to talking about, what magic actually is and the mechanics of that. This does relate to emerging science, quantum physics. And there's this idea of retrocausality and, our perceptions of time, the past, present, and future are not what we think they are. Now, that linear chain of events is really more of an appearance. It's a byproduct of our consciousness, our limited consciousness trying to make sense of what we experience in the outside world. So where I'm going with this is it's entirely possible that a resonance from an event that appears to be what we would call in the future actually goes what again appears to be backward in time and is picked up, is felt, experienced, interpreted by people or individuals who, again, from a conventional timeline, are in that past, or the event has not yet happened, but in some way, everything is simultaneous. So it's a real difficult thing to get your head around. But I can totally see how this idea of precognition and, future visions and stuff can work when you have that more enlarged, expanded perspective on time.
Well, that's remarkable because I've been deep into the study of quantum retrocausality in the last couple of weeks. The scientists who developed the theory and proved it won the Nobel Peace Prize for physics over it. And it's quite a remarkable thing how they do it and how they discovered it. But they definitely proved through multiple testing and retesting that the past can be erased. Now we'll wait till a bit later on when we talk about magic and the nervous system and so on. But for me, it started to answer questions about certain things. Like so many people I know who would say were the vanguards or the zealots of the past 3 years, the Rona years, should we call them, seem to have no apparent memory of it actually happening.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com